Welcome to the video of the study guide answers for session 3 of this Genesis Bible study series. How is the serpent able to talk? Well, if you want to take it metaphorically, you can just say that it maybe wasn't a serpent, could have been Satan himself, but they're just making him out to be a serpent because that's what other Near Eastern stories would have done at that time for something that was evil. Or you can say that Satan possessed the serpent, and so the serpent wasn't actually talking, but it was Satan talking through the serpent. Why do you think God made a tree Adam and Eve couldn't eat from? Quite simply, it's his love for Adam and Eve. That's why he made a tree they couldn't eat from. If you love someone, you have to give them the ability to love you and to not force them to love you. That's what we call free will. If someone doesn't have free will to love you and you're forcing them to, I would say that they are a slave. So God set up one tree that he said they couldn't eat from. So this gave Adam and Eve the ability to choose whether they wanted to obey God or to disobey God. What kind of fruit was on the tree of knowledge of good and evil? There's multiple potential answers here. One is that it was a fig tree, so it would have had figs, or more commonly, it's shown as an apple, so it would be an apple tree. I really like the church fathers who believed that the tree of knowledge of good and evil had leavened bread on it, or bread that needs yeast, and then the tree of life had unleavened bread. Was the serpent correct when he denied that eating the fruit would cause death? It depends on how you want to define correct. I think he was being deceptive. I think that he read into Adam and Eve that they felt they would immediately die if they ate of that fruit of that tree. So in that sense, I would say the serpent was correct because Adam and Eve themselves didn't die immediately. Although death did immediately enter, or not quite immediately after, but almost right after they eat of that fruit, death did enter in that animal that had to be sacrificed for the skins for Adam and Eve. But technically, I would say, if you look at it a certain way, that the serpent was correct, at least in terms of how Adam and Eve probably were thinking about it. What was the biggest mistake Eve made when interacting with the serpent? She shouldn't have talked to him. She should have just left him alone. And then to compound the problem, Adam didn't tell her to stop talking to him. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, there's a good chance that this wasn't their first interaction with the serpent. So Satan could have been building up a relationship with Eve and Adam over who knows how long, and we're just seeing the last bits of that and the repercussions of that last bit. But I have a feeling he had been working on them, trying to build up a trust with them. Maybe in the beginning, Eve didn't want to really interact with him. But also in Eve's defense, they were probably interacting, I'm not saying talking, but they were obviously interacting with other animals throughout the Garden of Eden as well. So maybe this didn't seem like a big stretch to start interacting with the serpent, even though the serpent was different than the other animals in that the serpent was talking. I think that should have thrown up a red flag, but it didn't. But I would say that Eve should just have not have interacted with the serpent. That would have stopped this problem right away. Why did God not want Adam and Eve to have the knowledge of good and evil like him? Well, depending on how you want to define knowledge of good and evil, what they actually got out of it, as we saw, was not good. That realization that they were naked, that they were weak, that they were vulnerable, that wasn't a good burden to have to carry. So, in that respect, that's why God didn't want them to have the knowledge of good and evil. If you want to say, why did God not want them to have the ability to be able to determine what was good and what was evil, I would say it's quite simply that there is only one God, and that's Him. And to have multiple gods, that just wouldn't work. There couldn't be order in the world if that was the case. What does it mean to know good and evil? Well, we had three definitions. One being that it would be the ability to be able to tell the difference between right and wrong. And I think we already proved that they already had that ability, because by telling them they couldn't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that would mean that they already knew that that was wrong, so they could discern between right or wrong. The second one was that it was more like a merism, so knowing good and evil means they would have known good and evil and everything in between. I don't think Adam and Eve would have had that ability at this time, mainly because as humans, we don't have knowledge of everything. Now, angels do have knowledge of everything. That's one reason why the demons will never change their mind, because God gave them the ability to know how their actions would play out, because they had supreme knowledge and they could see everything. Whereas for us, we sometimes don't realize something is good or bad until we've done it. And then hindsight, we can look back and change our opinion. So I wouldn't say that was it. I would say that it would be more the third meaning, which was that they wanted to have that ability to be able to determine what was good and what was evil. The original Hebrew text states Adam was present with Eve during the serpent's temptation. Why do you think he stayed silent and passive? Well, there's two trains of thought. One is he just didn't care that much. He was just kind of there. Or the other one is that he was enthralled by the serpent's talk as well. And like I said, maybe the serpent had already been working on them. So in Adam's mind, this wasn't a red flag that he should stop it, because they were used to talking to the serpent already. Do you see any parallels with today's society and how men act? Well, I think our society has tried to push that narrative that men shouldn't be quote unquote men anymore. And so the men that are kind of portrayed as being good are much more passive and silent. If you look at TV shows nowadays, the dad tends to be a bumbling idiot. Contrast that with TV shows from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, like Mike Brady or Ward Cleaver, and they were strong men. And so, yes, I think we become a society now where we're trying to stop men from being strong anymore. What does the realization of nakedness imply? Beyond the obvious physical reality of being naked, it showed that they were vulnerable and weak. And I think it's obvious even in that the way they tried to fix it was inadequate. Their clothing wasn't sufficient. And I think that probably caused them some panic that they couldn't resolve this problem that they were in on their own. Adam and Eve's clothing, made of fig leaves, did not sufficiently cover them. By eating the forbidden fruit, they find themselves in a difficult situation beyond their capacity to solve. Have you ever been in a similar situation where you couldn't get yourself out of a situation on your own? If so, how did you eventually get out of it? Well, the most obvious way to get out of a situation is ask for help. Sometimes pride gets in the way and we're afraid, or we just don't humble ourselves to ask for help. One could even make the argument that Adam and Eve fell into that trap. They didn't ask God for help, but obviously if they would have, then God would have known they did something they shouldn't. Another way that you can get out of a difficult situation is just take a step back, don't get too emotional about it, and just maybe reason your way through it. As humans, we do have that ability, as long as you don't panic. And then also, you could even just look for other resources. Like maybe if there was a book on how to make clothing in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve could have read that, and uh, then they would have been able to solve that themselves. But obviously, there wasn't that. Does something like the eating of the fruit in order to be like God and know good and evil happen in modern times? Yes, 100%. I think this happens every day. I think every human who has existed does that. I think we all want to decide for ourselves what is good and what is evil. In fact, we hear it all the time in quote unquote my truth. And so the number one sin that humans are still committing to this day is the same one Adam and Eve committed, which is eating of that forbidden fruit. Reflect on times you have done something you prefer God didn't know about. How does that affect your relationship with God? Obviously, it hurts your relationship with God. I would say that's for anyone, though. If you are hiding something from them, being somewhat dishonest, disingenuous, that relationship won't be as strong as it should. Despite being aware of Adam and Eve's location, God still asks where they are. Why would God do that? First and foremost, he's wanting to elicit a confession and start a dialogue, and that was the way he decided to go about it. And secondly, he could be showing just concern for their location and like what is going on. Why are they all of a sudden acting in the way that they're acting? Adam's response to God's question about eating the tree marked the first ever confession. What made his confession inadequate? First off, he started blaming others. He blamed Eve, and then in a roundabout way, he blamed God. So he wasn't taking responsibility for his actions. He did admit that he ate of the forbidden fruit, but he didn't say that he was the reason he did it. And ultimately, we could always blame others for anything that we've done, but you still have the choice to do it. And he's basically here, he's trying to say that he didn't have a choice. Between God and Eve, he was kind of in a way forced into doing that. And that's never a good way of confessing anything. Plus, he's not really showing any repentance as to what he did. How has blaming others affected your relationship with them? Not in a good way. If you blame others for things that you've done, even if they have a little bit of a role to play in it, I would say that puts them on the defensive. So can imagine the Adam and Eve scenario, and here's Adam with Eve right there, and he's saying, well, she's the problem. Imagine what her thought was. So that would have obviously put a little wedge in between them. And I see that in any relationship. If somebody knows or finds out that you're blaming them for something, that's probably going to affect your relationship in a very negative way. What makes it hard for individuals to take responsibility for their actions? Mainly sin, that pride, not wanting to admit that we did something wrong. And we're very good at being a rational being. We're very good at coming up with reasons as to why we did something. And it seems like we're very, very unlikely to want to blame ourselves. Even Jesus mentions that in the New Testament about we're worried about the splinter in someone else's eye and we don't see the log in our own eye. So people just always do that. We tend to look at ourselves in better light than someone else. How was Eve's confession slightly better than Adam's? Unlike Adam, Eve doesn't blame God. The serpent was created by God, so Eve could have done the same thing Adam did, which is blame God. But at least she didn't do that. So her confession was slightly better in that she didn't blame God. In what manner was her confession inadequate too? She fell into the same trap that Adam did, which is not repenting or technically even admitting what she did. She's blaming others and not showing any remorse at having done what she did. Was it just or unjust for God to punish Adam and Eve the way he did? I would say it was just. God knows best. He's all knowing. So he would know what would be the best form of punishment for Adam and Eve. He didn't kill them immediately. And as we saw in the previous video on this session, that by giving them time, they were able to reflect and eventually they were able to repent for what they had done. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time to contemplate on what you did do and to see the wrong of it. And over time, we might realize that our initial thought that we weren't responsible was wrong and that we actually were responsible. Another thing, too, is the actual punishments he gave. While there were some negative consequences to it, as I said in the video, actually had some good to them as well, and that kind of drew them closer together as a family. Suffering does tend to draw people close together. So I would say that the punishment was just. It seems unfair that God punishes us for the original sin of Adam and Eve. Why is this not unfair? Well, first off, for us, he just took away a grace. He's just no longer offering it. And you can think of it like, let's say there's a sale at a department store and it's for 1 week, and then you go 10 days later, so the sale's been over a few days, and then you expect to get that same sale. Well, they were only offering it for a short time, and then they took it away. That's their right to take it away. You can't go in and expect them to give you that sale. I mean, maybe if you push hard enough, you can get it, right? But I would say, no, it's not unfair for that reason. Also, God does give us a remedy for this punishment of original sin, in that if you get baptized, that washes away the original sin. How did God punish Adam, Eve, and the serpent differently? The serpent was cursed, whereas Adam and Eve were just punished. The serpent's curse was much more severe in that, in a way, the serpent is being isolated from other creatures. And we even see to this day that most people, quote unquote, hate snakes, really don't like them. And then Adam and Eve's punishment was the opposite, in that by their suffering, they would be drawn closer together. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 is called the Proto-Evangelium, or the first gospel. What is the significance of this verse? The significance is that it gives hope first to Adam and Eve, but then later on to anyone who would be reading this narrative. And it's basically saying that death will be conquered one day through the Messiah, or Jesus. Can you define enmity? Enmity is a strong dislike of something, a deep hatred or dislike of something. Who is the woman God is talking about in this verse? Well, you can take it two ways, and I think both are correct. He's talking about Eve's lineage, but then he's also talking about Mary, as well as Jesus comes from Mary, and Mary comes from Eve. And further evidence is that both Eve and Mary are called woman at various points in the Bible. Who is the one that will strike or crush the head of the serpent? Well, here there's some disagreement, on interpretation of words. Some places it says he will strike or crush the head. Other interpretations say she will strike or crush the head. If you want to take it as she, that would imply that Mary will strike or crush the head of the serpent. If you want to take it as he, that would mean that Jesus, through his crucifixion, will strike and crush the head of the serpent. But in my opinion, either way, it's basically saying the same thing, that death will be conquered. What is the significance of God replacing Adam and Eve's fig leaf garments with garments of skin? Two main significances here. One is that God is remedying the problem that Adam and Eve are having, which is they can't equip themselves with good enough clothing to cover their shame. So they would have been walking around in shame until God fixed that problem by giving them correct clothing. And then secondly, that God would have had to kill an animal to get the skin. So this would have been not only the first death, which does happen fairly immediately after the eating of that forbidden fruit, but it's also the first animal sacrifice in the biblical text. What was the reason behind God banishing Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden? He didn't want them eating anymore from the tree of life, since they were in a state of sin, as you were. That is considered an unhappy existence, and God didn't want them to live an immortal life and be unhappy. And as humans, we're geared towards God. That's our nature. And yes, a lot of people don't understand that today. And that's why you see a lot of unhappiness in this world, because people aren't focusing on God enough. But God realized this with Adam and Eve, and he realized that death was a remedy for sin. What is a cherubim? A cherubim is one of the 9 choirs of angels. They're at the second highest tier, so they're the second closest to God. The cherubim were sent, or at least a few of the cherubim were sent to guard the gates of the Garden of Eden, so Adam and Eve couldn't go back in to partake or eat of the tree of life again. How is God not letting Adam and Eve live an immortal life while in a sinful state a charitable action? Well, it's charitable because to live in that state forever of unhappiness would be, in a way, kind of torturous. So by allowing them to die and for death to take its natural course, they have time to get closer to God again, and then get a relief from that unhappiness that they would have had they lived forever. How is death the remedy for sin? Well, first and foremost, it ends unhappiness. But there's also more to it than just that, as we talked about. As you get closer to death, you have to get humility. You have to rely on others to bathe you, clothe you. People are going to be seeing you naked, that you maybe not would want to see you naked. So that's very humbling, not only just for you, but for the people who are taking care of you. Then as people get older, they tend to reflect on their life and start regretting things that they did in their past. And then hopefully they can get that reconciliation or closeness back to God. And that's good preparation for death. So you end up in a good state right before you die. And really, those 3 steps tend to happen more as you get older. I don't think too many people think of like some 95-year-old as being super sinful person anymore, right? But we know when you're young, teenager, 20s, 30s, you're much more likely to sin as well. So you can see just even there that as you progress up in age, and of course there's exceptions to this, but anyway, as you progress more in age, you tend to sin less and less. The Bible does not elaborate on the difference between the offerings that were presented to God by Abel and Cain. Why do you think God liked Abel but not Cain's offering? Most likely just because Abel was giving better things to God. He was putting more effort and more thought into his relationship with God. Whereas Cain was just kind of like tossing things aside, maybe just without thinking, giving God sacrifices and things like that. And if you watch the previous video, I think my analogy with the food was a good one. And God would feel that exact same way. If you were giving God the bad stuff and you were keeping the good stuff for yourself, of course he's going to find that as being disrespectful. As would anybody if you did that if they came over to your house. What do you believe led Cain to kill Abel? Most likely jealousy, and then him having anger. He wasn't able to rationalize his decision. So he just kind of lashed out, struck out, probably without thinking too much. He probably had a belief that God was favoring Abel for no real reason. And so he knew he couldn't do anything to God, but what he could do is he could injure someone God cared a lot about. In what way does anger affect one's judgment? Not in a good way, and I would go so far as to say most emotions, whether good or bad, under those states, it's not good to make decisions, choices. They usually don't end up turning well. And I can't think of any situation where anger, in and of itself, as an emotion, leads to anything good. So I would say always step back, make sure that you are looking at things through a non-emotional lens before making any decisions. Why did God choose not to kill Cain? Simple answer, mercy. God was allowing Cain to have time to reflect on what he did, and hopefully once that anger would subside, he would realize what he did was wrong and he would repent. Now we know, at least tradition says, that Cain never did repent for what he did. From where did Cain's wife originate? I gave two examples, and I think those two examples are good ones. It could have been other humanoid-like creatures that didn't have the rational soul like Cain would have had and like Adam and Eve would have had. That could have been one answer, but more than likely it was one of his sisters. Is there a chance that humans return to the Garden of Eden and eat from the tree of life again? In Revelation, it talks about the tree of life now being in heaven and that the elect will, or the chosen will, be able to eat from it again. So the answer would definitely be yes. And in this case, though, heaven has taken a place of the Garden of Eden. But when we look at prefigurations, Garden of Eden was most likely a prefiguration of heaven. What was the reason for people's long lifespans before the flood in Genesis? Once again, you can have two answers. One is that they lived that long so that they would have more time to make more babies and make more humans quicker, and or they just lived longer because the world wasn't in as sinful of a state. So sin, as it got worse and worse, that ended up making life expectancies go down. But then you can also look at it in that honorific sense where it was just showing that Adam was a great man, so he lived for a long time. Would you like to live 900 years? I can answer this real simply and say that, what do you mean by live? Do you mean live on the earth for 900 years? If I lived on the earth for 900 years, I would want to be healthy. I would want my family to be alive still. And if that was the case, maybe. But I'm going to live 900 years and much longer than that if I make it to heaven. So in some ways, you could look at this as a bit of a trick question. Of course, I would like to live 900 years. I'd like to live a lot more than that, and hopefully I will get that chance by making it to heaven. If people believe in the existence of heaven, why do they want to live for many years? Well, if you're talking about getting to heaven, then I'd say, well, yeah, I'd want to live forever in heaven, so that's obvious. Now, if you're talking about earth, that does beg the question a little bit, because if heaven is as great as it is, then why live 90 years, 100 years on earth, especially if maybe the last 20 years you're suffering a lot? Now, there's deep, meaningful answers that you could get for that. One being, your suffering on earth, you can give up to God, and He can use that to benefit others. You can also say that while you're on earth, the longer you live, maybe you can get other people to get to heaven by making them believe stronger in God. So you can look at it in those lights and say that it is well worth living for a long time, and not take that selfish route of, well, no, it'd be better if I just die and then I get to heaven. That's it for the study guide questions for session 3. I'd like to thank you for making it to the end, and also realize that these are just my answers. There are other answers as well. So if some of the answers that you thought of didn't jive with my answers, it doesn't mean that your answers were incorrect. And I look forward to seeing you next time.